I stepped into the basement laundry at 1 a.m., and the pull-chain bulb was still swaying. A styrofoam cup of cold coffee sat sweating on the washer I'd just loaded, a wet ring bleeding into the lid. The air smelled like warm lint and stale smoke, and the dryer's drum ticked as it coasted to a stop. My footsteps sounded loud on the concrete. The dehumidifier hummed like a low throat, and the chain kept swinging after I stood still. Whoever had been down there left their touches in polite little gestures. The cup angled away from the edge. A basket nudged closer to the machines. A dryer sheet folded like a note on my laundry, except I didn't bring any. By day, the basement felt honest, cinderblock walls, a pull-chain bulb, and the steady hum of a dehumidifier swallowing damp. I lived in an old off-campus fourplex with a shared coin-op laundry and wire storage cages padlocked with our initials. I usually did loads late. A jar of quarters rode in my hoodie, and my headphones sat around my neck because noise carried up the stairs. The stair door self-latched with a heavy thud you felt in your ribs. The bulkhead had a rusted hasp nobody touched. The drop to the alley looked like a throat. Neighbors rarely came down except to swap a load. The ceiling was low enough to make you duck, cell service thin near the boiler, and the concrete held a cold that climbed your ankles. If anything went wrong, it was just me, my stuff, and a flight of splintered steps between me and the street. I treated it as safe until small changes stacked up. Next time I went down, the lock looked right until I noticed it was clipped through a different hole. The hair I'd slid under the latch was snapped and gone, and a neatly folded T sat on top of my hamper like a polite signature. I stood listening to the dehumidifier when the dryer's coin box gave a single clink, one coin settling in a room with no one moving. The pull chain spun gently, though I wasn't near it, and the air felt still. I told myself roommates were careless, or maybe the manager had checked something and relocked it wrong. I even tried to believe I'd folded that tea and forgotten. Then I touched the styrofoam cup from earlier and felt the coffee's core lukewarm under the thin lid. Warm means recent. Recently meant someone else's hands minutes ago. Coincidence started to feel like a story I was telling myself. By the next week, the basement began arranging itself without me. A folding chair sat at the foot of the stairs like a reserved seat, its rubber feet leaving quarter moons in the dust. Behind the water heater, I found an ashtray balanced on a pipe bracket, ash still warm when I tapped it. My bike seat was lowered by an inch. The quick release left me shy of snug. A sticky note appeared on the washer, "Don't throw away my soap," in handwriting none of my roommates used. Near the boiler room door, a dusty shoe print faced the lock, toes pointed in, as if waiting. When the furnace kicked, a faint draft slid from under that door and brushed my shins. I started tracking. I brushed powder on the step, straightened the chair, and raised the seat. Each time I came back, the chair moved a finger's width, and the seat slipped again. Trust shrank to a pinhole, doubt filled the room. Enough guessing, I needed answers I could test. I called the property manager and listened to keys rattle through the receiver while he checked logs. No maintenance scheduled, no contractors authorized, boiler room to remain locked. I set a cheap motion chime inside my storage cage, taped a sliver of receipt across the bulkhead seam, and tucked my phone's voice recorder behind paint cans to catch whatever moved when I wasn't there. At dusk I went down and let my phone light skate along the cinder block. Dust swirled in the beam. The dehumidifier hummed like a calm engine. Concrete held the day's cold, the air tasted metallic. I swept past the heater, the chair, the cage, and paused at a shelf that didn't sit flush. The side edge cast a hairline shadow where the wall should have met it. I pressed the frame. It flexed inward, quiet, deliberate, like a hinged panel testing my hand back. Light found a seam, something beyond breed cool. The chime inside my cage pinged once, and a bolt scraped on the far side of the boiler room. Two sounds, two places. I eased the shelf toward me, and the unit pivoted on hinges. Behind the pink insulation lay a rolled sleeping bag, a jar of change, noodle cups, a tool roll, and a crushed pack of cigarettes. The air back there was cold or used. I lifted my light and saw prints of dusty palms on the joists above my head. This wasn't roommate carelessness. Someone lived here, listening to our routines and moving when the machines masked them. My mouth went dry. The bolt raked again, deliberate this time, and a faint cough answered from the crawl. Whatever control I thought I had flipped, and I felt suddenly the sleeping bag, the stair door above thudded and the latch clicked, the self-lock engaging. Soft steps crept across the joists like fingertips. The pull chain snapped dark, then flicked back on, making the shadows swing. Gravel skittered at the bulkhead, and behind the boiler room a breathy cough threaded through metal. Inside and outside blurred, pressure pushed from both directions. The knob on the stair door turned a fraction, then held, like a hand deciding if I'd answer. The dehumidifier's hum dipped and came back, and the cold in the crawlspace touched my wrist. I could feel the house choosing sides, and it wasn't mine. I pictured the alley, 10 feet of night, and the hallway, 10 steps to a locked door. My throat stayed quiet. If I yelled, I'd give them my location. If I moved, something would scrape. I scanned for tools, for angles, for hinges. I wasn't hunting. I was boxed in, waiting to move first. Metal bit metal as I slid a flathead into the strike plate and torqued. The knob twitched from the other side, tapping my knuckles, but the latch flexed. I shoved a rolling laundry cart under the knob to lift it a hair and kept pressure on the blade. The latch slipped, then popped with a dry clack. I shouldered through, stumbled into the hallway, and slammed the door. Heat hissed from the radiator as I leaned my back to it and drew a breath that tasted like dust and copper. "Police are on the way," I called, steady. Fast scuffs hit the concrete below, and the bulkhead rattled, then went silent. I thumbed 911 and kept my eyes on the knob while the dispatcher answered in my ear. I gave the address and said basement. Outside, sirens unfurled and began to swell toward our block. I held the door, listening for the next scrape, and braced for whatever opened first. Officers swept the basement while I stayed in the hallway with the radiator hissing. They found a pallet bed behind the hinged shelf, a tool roll with a utility knife, and a contractor's badge that didn't match any vendor on file. Fresh pry marks scarred the bulkhead hasp, flakes of rust on the floor like paprika. A neighbor's camera caught a figure slipping through the alley, a backpack tucked tight. By morning, the manager changed locks, stapled up a notice about laundry hours, and mounted a camera over the stairs. The hum down there sounded different after that, emptier but watchful. I started carrying my loads at noon, never with headphones, never alone. The smell of stale smoke faded, but the folded dryer sheet kept appearing some weekends. Once, after they rekeyed, noise returned to normal. The silence never did completely. I learned that basements don't just store our stuff, they store our assumptions about who belongs there. Under concrete and pipes, the rules feel inherited until someone writes their own schedule under your feet. Locks, hinges, and access points mattered more than my comfort. Once those were loose, I was just hoping routine would protect me. Now I verify work orders before anyone steps inside, keep the stair door propped when I'm down there, and listen for changes. A moved lock hole, a draft where there wasn't one, a cup still warm. I label keys, track who has them, and treat the bulkhead like a second front door, not a forgotten exit. Cheap tools helped, a motion chime, a door wedge, tape across a seam. None of it is dramatic, all of it buys time. If you're listening late, take 60 seconds after this to check your bulkhead, your cage lock, and who holds keys. A quick walkthrough now means sleep. The knock came like a cop's, 3 hard blows that rattled the storm door. Rain ticked against the frame while a man in a yellow slicker lifted a badge to the glass. The gas company, he said, needed an urgent meter check and needed access to my basement. I kept the chain and felt my dog's growl buzz through my wrist. In the street, a van idled, exhaust pooling, a crooked logo beaded with water. He leaned on urgently like a lever, voice steady, eyes sliding past me toward the stairs. Cold air pushed through the mail slot, carrying that faint metallic smell. Everything looked official enough to open, and just strange enough to hold shut. I stood there weighing which mistake would cost more tonight. Most days my house felt simple. I lived alone in a small place with an interior stairwell to the basement and a steel bulkhead along the side yard. The gas meter sat beside the humming furnace. The dehumidifier clicked on and off like a metronome. I kept the stairs swept, a hand on the rail where one tread squeaked, and labeled the breakers. Neighborly but careful fit my lane. I waved to the mail carrier, traded shovel turns with the guy next door, and verified any story before I unlatched a door. A leak was a real risk where winter sealed windows tight, so I kept the utility number taped inside a cabinet. But the stairs from the kitchen dropped to the center of the house. If a stranger reached that landing with a key or a badge, they owned everything below my feet. Safety, for me, depended on choosing who crossed that threshold every single time I unlocked anything. His story arrived preloaded. A reported leak on the block. Just need to check your lines real quick. He kept one hand tucked inside the slicker, the other pinning the badge to the glass as his eyes slid past my shoulder toward the basement door. Your meter isn't remote read, he added like a correction, so this is time sensitive. I felt the chain pull taut in my fingers. Wet prints from his boot bled onto the mat, darkening. Let's get this open so we can keep everyone safe, he said, testing authority against habit. My dog's growl rolled under the fridge's hum. I asked for a work order number. He pivoted to urgency instead of answering and tapped the badge with a fingernail. Details might have been nothing once, but the crooked logo on the van, the hand he wouldn't show, and that practice script began lining up, detail by detail. Up close, the badge looked home-laminated, the edges cloudy, and the hologram printed, not shifting. The hotline on his card rang to a generic voicemail tree, not a dispatcher, and while I held the phone to my ear, he sidestepped out of my doorbell camera's view. What's the work order number? I asked. He repeated my street name, like a line he'd learned, and didn't produce a leak detector, just a cheap CO alarm dangling from a lanyard that wasn't powered on. My dog's growl deepened until it vibrated through my wrist. The fridge hummed, steady as a metronome, while his eyes slid toward the side yard, toward the bulkhead I rarely used. He kept one hand hidden, thumb grazing the slicker seam, the other open in a show of calm. The urgency felt staged, not professional, volume where there should have been procedure. Doubt set a hook. If this was real, he'd welcome verification. Instead, he wanted the chain gone now. I dialed the utility number on my bill instead of his card and put it on speaker, tinny holding music filling the entryway. Your employee ID? I asked through the chain. He rattled a sequence too smooth, then stepped off the porch to check the foundation vents, rain beads flashing on his slicker. His flashlight skimmed the side path and paused on the basement window, the beam whitening cobwebs. My dog tracked him with a low whine. The real dispatcher clicked back on. No technicians in my area, no leak alerts, and my account showed a smart meter, no entry required. She said his badge number didn't match their format. Keep the door locked. Call 911, she added, voice calm. I wrote the time on his card and drove the deadbolt deeper. Outside, the van idled. The side yard fell dark except for a moving oval of light. I stepped toward the basement door, every board of the house suddenly louder. A soft rap came from ankle height, a knuckle on the basement window, separate from the man moving in the yard. My dog's ears snapped toward the stairs. His flashlight oval swung across the siding, but the sound rose from the window well. The dispatcher stayed on the line while I whispered what I'd heard. 2 people at least. One in view, one crouched where the glass meets dirt, maybe a third at the bulkhead taking cues from the van. This wasn't reassurance, it was a probe, entries tested in sequence and timed to my pauses. Control flipped. The house felt small, the staircase a throat they wanted. I set my palm on the basement knob and felt a cold draft pressing up, like a breath waiting for me to choose wrong tonight. I killed the lamps until the house became a reflection, then slid the deadbolt home and moved to the basement door. Cold air pushed up from below, as if the stairwell were breathing. The bulkhead handle rattled, metal scraping metal in short tests. Gravel crunched outside. A flashlight halo drifted across the vent and flicked away. My dog pressed against my leg, muscles tight as cable. A hand found the interior knob and gave it a patient twist, then let it settle back, listening. I'm locking the basement, I told the dispatcher, keeping my voice steady for whoever was on the other side. Officers are close, she said. Hold position and stay loud. I slid the barrel bolt and wedged a chair under the handle. The van's idle deepened, then eased, as though the driver feathered the gas. Rain hissed outside. I stood in the dark counting breaths, tracing exits, waiting to choose between shouting and forcing their next move. Enough waiting. I snapped on the side yard floodlight and washed the hedges in white. Police are en route. I called through the storm door, voice flat. The man on the porch rocked back a step, face tightening. The van's taillights pulsed red. I grabbed a pan from the drying rack and hammered it against the railing. The clang leapt down the block. A bedroom light snapped on across the street. Tires hissed on wet pavement. The van eased forward, then picked up, logo wobbling. By the bulkhead a darker figure vaulted the fence, coat flaring, shoes thudding once in the mud. My dog barked, sharp and mean, driving them faster. Stay with me, the dispatcher said. Units are almost there. I kept talking, address, descriptions, plate partial, while I held the deadbolt and watched shadows slide off the siding. The van turned the corner. The yard went still. Blue strobes washed the road as a patrol car finally swung while rain slackened. They found pry marks on the bulkhead hasp and prints under the basement window, toes dug in at the sill. My neighbor texted over doorbell footage, the van's plate half-taped, the logo peeling. Dispatch called the utility on a recorded line. Again, no technicians were out, and the badge number didn't exist in their system. The gas smell I noticed earlier wasn't gas at all. A plumber flushed a dry floor drain, and the odor vanished with a gulp. The house felt quieter that night, but every creak got its own meaning. I slept with the basement light on for a week, and kept the chair under the door. The lesson settled like dust. They weren't chasing meters. They were chasing entry, and my stairs were the fastest way to take the whole house. A vest and a laminated card can borrow authority faster than you can breathe, and urgency can pry your locks open from the inside. I learned to slow that impulse. I verified using the number I chose, not the one on a card, and I met techs at the gate or under the porch light, never at the basement steps. I added a hasp to the bulkhead, motion lights to the side yard, and labeled the shutoffs so I could talk a dispatcher through them. My dog became policy. If he growled, I listened. I asked for a work order and an employee ID, then confirmed the truck number and plate with the utility. If any piece wobbles, the door stays closed. Most meters here are remote read. Anyone insisting otherwise has to prove it without crossing my threshold. If you're listening at night, put the utility numbers in your phone and teach your household the script. Verify, deny entry, and call. The door above me clicked and the childproof slide bolt scraped home, a thin, final sound. The fluorescent tube buzzed like a trapped insect, and the sump pump's wet motor chewed at the pit. Footsteps crossed the kitchen and paused over the stairs. The joists ticked as weight settled. A colder draft curled down the risers, carrying rain and a metallic basement tang. I stood on bare concrete, one hand on the rail, trying to think louder than the hum. My phone was upstairs, 10 steps and one locked door away. I'd come down to move boxes off the sump, nothing stranger than a storm. Then the house decided which side of the door I belonged to on that rainy night. Before that lock slid, the house felt straightforward. I was house-sitting for a co-worker in a modest ranch with a half-finished basement, a walkout slider facing a hedge, and a dehumidifier that thrummed like a distant engine. She'd warned me the basement door sticks, and asked me to check the sump during the storm watch. The place smelled like laundry detergent and cut lumber. Dust lifted when I tugged the chain. A fluorescent tube flickered to life with a pop, buzzing over concrete that ran a shade colder than upstairs. I walked the routine the first evening. Food for her dog, towels off the floor, boxes moved away from the pit, breaker labels read twice. The slider had a wooden dowel on the track, and the bulkhead wore a new padlock. The steps were narrow but honest. The railing wobbled but held. Keep the basement dry, keep the dog fed, wait out the weather. That was the job for that night. Before the rain thickened, small things fell off. The walkout slider's dowel sat set aside on the track, like someone meant to open it and forgot. I put it back, then found it nudged after I carried towels downstairs. A cool ribbon of air slipped under the door and licked my shins even with the furnace holding steady. Near the sump, a puck-shaped alarm vibrated faintly on the concrete like an agitated beetle, making the strangest shiver through the floor. Upstairs, a ceramic mug I hadn't used waited in the sink, a thin brown ring staining the inside as if it had dried before I arrived. I told myself drafts, settling, and the last house sitter. But each detail leaned into the next. The dowel moved. The air crept. The puck quivered for no reason I knew. Coincidence stacked like boxes until it felt like someone else's routine, set beneath mine. By nightfall, the house kept answering back. The silverware drawer sat one slot off, spoons riding where forks should go. The hallway rug nudged an inch toward the kitchen like it had crept on pads. Downstairs, the fluorescent glowed, even though I knew I'd flipped it off. I told myself I was tired. Fridge hummed. The dog flicked an ear and went still. I dusted baby powder across the stair treads and balanced a folded receipt in the basement door jamb, a hinge. Then I waited for the furnace to cycle and the dehumidifier to click on. A darker shape gathered in the crack beneath the door, widening as if someone stood right there. When I stepped onto the first creaking board, it withdrew like breath. The powder lay undisturbed, but my shoulders wouldn't drop. The house felt observed from inside, routines misfiled by someone unseen. Trust thinned. Doubt took over the room, and I started planning how to test the locks. When she hesitated, the house seemed to hold its breath. I called my coworker and asked who else had keys. A pause, paper rustle, then. A contractor hadn't returned a set months ago. She'd meant to rekey but never did. I thanked her and decided to make the basement answer. I wedged a chair under the knob, back angled to lift it a hair. I set a flathead on the workbench within reach and hung a wind chime from a peg by the stairs so any draft would sing. The fluorescent buzzed overhead. The dehumidifier hummed its note. From the bottom step, I watched the rectangle at the door's base, a fingertip of light laid across concrete. Dust drifted in the beam, then settled. No footfalls, no voices, just systems. Still, the gap breathed, cooler on my shins than the room behind me. I waited through a full cycle, straining, until the dog exhaled upstairs, and something faint clicked near the latch. Halfway up, the house made the choice for me. The top door swung in, then slammed, and the child-proof slide bolt snicked home from the other side, practiced. One slow step crossed the kitchen. The joist above my head ticked. The fluorescent buzzed. The sump chewed water, too loud for how still everything felt. Whoever had that key wasn't passed. They knew the basement better than I did. I put my palm to the knob and felt nothing but cold paint and the chill of a draft coming down. Control flipped. I wasn't checking a sump. I was a problem to contain. I backed down 2 treads, listening to the floor settle, and stared at the hinges and the walkout. If the door belonged to them, I'd need another way out. I couldn't call. My phone was on the kitchen counter buzzing against wood. The deck boards over the walkout groaned, slow weight testing each plank. Across the house, the bulkhead thudded, metal on metal, a palm trying the hasp. I pressed my ear to the door and heard breath through teeth, a measured hiss, then the lightest test of the knob. A patient half-turn that stopped when the hinge ticked. Inside was me, bare feet on concrete. Outside was rain and people who knew the house better than I did. The stairs squeaked on the 3rd tread and the 7th. I couldn't risk announcing every step. I eased back, keeping the chair wedged, and mapped the room in my head. Workbench, hinge pins, slider tools. The sump pump cycled on, covering small noises. If I was getting out, it had to happen under that cover. I gripped the flathead and counted, waiting for the next hum from the sump pump. I went silent and aimed for the hinges. I set the flathead under the first pin and tapped, each metallic tick drowned by the sump pump's sudden churn. The pin crept up, then slipped free into my palm. The second followed with a dry click. I lifted the door just enough to clear the latch, chest tight, and tilted it off the jamb. I eased it against the frame so it looked shut, the chair still wedged beneath the knob. Barefoot, I ran through the laundry room, skated across cold concrete, and shouldered the walkout. Rain hit my face. I sprinted for the side gate and cut through puddles to the neighbor's porch, pounding until the porch light snapped on. "Call 911, I said quietly. We watched the hedges shiver. A figure ghosted between shrubs toward the street, head down, a coat flaring. Sirens began to paint the block with distant color, growing brighter as the squad car rolled up, soft blue light washing the hedges. Officers cleared the house, then swept the yard with flashlights. They found shoe scuffs by the slider and a new padlock on the bulkhead hasp that hadn't been there earlier. Downstairs, a narrow gap behind freestanding shelves led toward the walkout. Inside the crawl they pulled a sleeping roll, a charging cable, and a ceramic mug that was still warm. Records later showed the place sat empty for months before my co-worker moved in, and the contractor crew had kept keys longer than the contract. We never got a face, a shape on hedges, and a network of access points. The house quieted after rekeying, but every creak announced itself. Noise returned to systems. The silence kept a human outline I couldn't convince myself to erase. After that night, I kept my phone on me like a house key, even for the trash. In the basement, I learned the map of my exits, which hinges lift, which window locks are painted, how the bulkhead opens, and which side the hasp bites. I practiced popping hinge pins, crossing in the dark without floorboards singing, and finding a flashlight by feel. I stopped assuming a sticking door was harmless. I tested if it stuck for me, or someone on the other side. We rekeyed every lock, added sensors to the bulkhead and slider, and labeled spare keys like library cards. I saved utility numbers and printouts, taped them inside a cabinet, and I listened when the dog growled. Small things by time. A wedge, a motion chime, a dowel cut to length. If you're listening right now, walk to your basement door after this, check the bolt, the slider dowel, and who still has keys. You'll sleep easier knowing.